January 29, 1945. 2:47 p.m. Holtzheim, Belgium. First Sergeant Leonard Funk rounded the corner of the farmhouse and stopped cold. 90 German soldiers were staring straight at him. Some stood frozen, rifles already in their hands. Others were bending down, grabbing weapons from a pile in the snow. Their breath fogged the air. Boots shifted. Metal clinked. For American soldiers were kneeling in front of them, hands locked behind their heads. 20 minutes earlier, those Germans had been prisoners of war. 80 of them, captured during Company CS assault on the village, guarded by only 4 Americans because that was all Funk could spare. The fighting wasn't over yet. Men were spread thin. Everyone was needed. Now the prisoners were free. Armed. And organizing. A German officer stepped forward. Tall. Red-faced. Furious. He slammed the muzzle of an MP-40 submachine gun into Funk's stomach and shouted something in German. Funk didn't understand a word of it. The officer screamed again, louder, spittle flying from his mouth. Funk looked at the gun pressed into his gut. Looked at the 90 Germans. Looked at his 4 men, helpless in the snow. And then, he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle. Not a polite grin. He laughed hard. Bent forward. Shoulders shaking. A deep, uncontrollable laugh that echoed off the frozen farmhouse walls. The German officer froze, stunned. He screamed again, veins bulging, face turning purple with rage. Funk laughed harder. What happened next would take less than 60 seconds. When it was over, 21 German soldiers would be dead. The rest would throw down their weapons and surrender. And Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. would earn the Medal of Honor for one of the most unbelievable acts of close-quarters combat in World War II. Leonard Funk was not supposed to be a legend. He was born on August 27, 1916, in Braddock Township, Pennsylvania, a steel town carved from smoke, iron, and sweat along the Monongahela River. 8 miles east of Pittsburgh. The kind of place where boys grew up fast because they had no choice. By the time Funk graduated high school in 1934, the Great Depression had already hollowed out the country. Mills shut down. Jobs vanished. Families survived week to week. College wasn't an option, it was a fantasy. Funk took responsibility early. He helped raise his younger brother. He worked whatever jobs he could find. He didn't complain. He didn't dream big. He just kept moving forward. In June of 1941, as war tore across Europe and Asia, Congress expanded the draft. Leonard Funk's number came up. He reported to the induction center in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. 24 years old. 5'5". 140 pounds. The Army physical examiner probably looked at him and thought, Clark material. They were wrong. Funk volunteered for the paratroopers. In 1941, American airborne forces were barely real. Jumping out of airplanes behind enemy lines sounded insane to most soldiers. Dangerous. Experimental. Almost suicidal. The men who volunteered were different. Airborne training was designed to break you. 5 weeks of relentless punishment, running until lungs burned, climbing until hands bled, falling until bones ached. Half the candidates washed out. Then came the jump towers. Then the aircraft. The first time you step out of a C-47 at 1,200 feet, every instinct in your body screams to grab the doorframe and hold on. The wind tears at your face. The ground looks impossibly far away. Your parachute is nothing but fabric, cords, and faith. Leonard Funk jumped anyway. He earned his wings. He was assigned to Company C, 1st Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, training at Camp Blanding, Florida. By late 1943, the regiment shipped out to England and joined the legendary 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans. These men were veterans of Sicily and Italy. They had already jumped into combat. They had already buried friends. Funk was the new guy. At 27, he was old by paratrooper standards. Most of his squad mates were barely 20. But Funk had something they didn't: calm. Steadiness. The kind of quiet confidence that makes men listen when things start going wrong. By D-Day, he was a squad leader. First, though, he had to survive Normandy. June 6, 1944. 1:30 a.m. The C-47 Skytrain shuddered as German flak exploded around it. Funk stood in the stick, paratroopers lined up shoulder to shoulder, 60 pounds of gear strapped to their bodies. The aircraft was flying too low. Only 400 feet. But the pilots couldn't climb. The sky was alive with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers sliced through the darkness like red lightning. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage. The green light came on. Funk jumped. The prop blast hit him like a truck. Then the chute snapped open, and suddenly the world went quiet. Below him was France. Occupied France. Enemy territory in every direction. The airborne invasion was chaos from the first second. German fire scattered the drop planes across 50 miles. Men landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others dropped directly into German positions and were killed before they could cut themselves free. Funk hit the ground hard. His ankle twisted violently. Pain exploded up his leg. Badly sprained, maybe broken. Every step would be agony. He stood up anyway. He buried his parachute and started moving. He was 40 miles from his drop zone. Alone. Injured. Behind enemy lines. By dawn, he wasn't alone anymore. Lost paratroopers began drifting toward him, men from different units, different companies, all disoriented, all looking for leadership. Funk gave it to them. 18 men total. For 10 days, Leonard Funk led that group through German-held territory. They moved at night. Hid by day. Fought when they had to. Funk insisted on serving as lead scout despite his injured ankle, placing himself in the most dangerous position to protect his men. On June 17, they linked up with Allied forces. Every single man survived. No casualties. 10 days. 40 miles. Enemy territory. The Army awarded Funk the Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and his first Purple Heart. And the war was only just beginning. By the summer of 1944, Leonard Funk had already done enough to justify a lifetime of quiet pride. Most men would have gone home heroes after Normandy. Funk didn't even slow down. He limped through the pain, his ankle still swollen, still stiff, still aching with every step. In the 82nd Airborne, injuries were treated with one simple question: can you still fight? Funk could. So he stayed. By September, the war had shifted north. The Allies were racing toward Germany, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed he had found a way to end the war before Christmas. Operation Market Garden. It would be the largest airborne assault in history. More than 35,000 paratroopers would drop into the Netherlands, capturing a chain of bridges stretching 64 miles. British, American, and Polish airborne units would land behind enemy lines. Ground forces would punch through and link up with them. If it worked, the Allies would drive straight into Germany's industrial heartland. If it failed, no one wanted to finish that sentence. On September 17, 1944, Leonard Funk jumped again. This time, the landing went according to plan, at least at first. Company C secured its immediate objectives near the Dutch town of Nijmegen. The fighting was sharp but manageable. Germans were retreating. Momentum seemed to be on the Allies' side. Then Funk noticed something that didn't belong. 3 German 20mm flak guns were firing from elevated ground near the village of Valberg. They weren't shooting at paratroopers. They were shooting at gliders. The slow, fragile gliders were coming in loaded with reinforcements, jeeps, artillery, ammunition, medics. They had no engines. No second chances. Once released, they were committed. The flak bursts ripped through the air around them. If those guns kept firing, men would die before they ever touched the ground. Funk didn't wait for orders. He grabbed the nearest soldiers he could find. 3 men. That was it. Standard doctrine said you needed at least 3 attackers for every defender when assaulting a prepared position. Funk had the opposite. The gun position was well dug in. Sandbags. Camouflage. Interlocking fields of fire. Approximately 20 German soldiers manning the guns and providing security. 3 Americans. 20 Germans. Funk attacked anyway. He moved fast, using the terrain, closing the distance before the Germans realized what was happening. The first shots dropped the security detail. Funk led the assault straight into the gun pits, firing point blank. The fighting was brutal and close. Seconds felt like hours. When it was over, all 3 flak guns were silent. The gliders landed safely. 20 German soldiers were dead or captured. 3 Americans walked away. For that action, Leonard Funk received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the U.S. Army. He now wore a Silver Star and a DSC. Most soldiers would never see either. Funk still wasn't finished. Market Garden collapsed around him. British paratroopers at Arnhem were surrounded by SS Panzer divisions that intelligence had missed. For 9 days, they fought house to house until their ammunition ran out. Of 10,000 men, barely 2,000 escaped. A bridge too far, history would call it. But Funk didn't know the history yet. He only knew the war was getting worse. On December 16, 1944, the Germans struck back. Hard. 3 entire armies surged out of the Ardennes forest under cover of fog and snow. 400,000 men. Over 1,000 tanks. Nearly 2,000 artillery pieces. Hitler was gambling everything. He aimed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West so Germany could turn fully against the Soviet Union. For the Americans, it was hell. Thin lines collapsed. Green units shattered. Veterans were overwhelmed. Thousands surrendered. The German advance carved a massive bulge into the Allied front. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The weather was merciless. Temperatures plunged below zero. Snow fell relentlessly. Men froze in foxholes. Weapons jammed. Vehicles wouldn't start. And then came Normandy. December 17, 1944. A convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion ran into an SS armored spearhead near the Borgness crossroads. These weren't frontline infantry, radio operators, artillery observers, rear echelon troops. They surrendered. 113 Americans were disarmed and herded into a field. Then the SS opened fire. Machine guns. Pistols. Rifles. 84 men were slaughtered where they stood. Some survived by playing dead, lying in the snow as German boots passed inches from their faces. When night fell, 43 wounded men crawled back to American lines. The news spread like wildfire. The rules were gone. When Funk heard about Normandy, something inside him hardened. This wasn't war anymore. This was murder. From that moment on, Leonard Funk made a decision he would never say out loud. He would never surrender. January 1945. The German offensive had finally been broken. Now the Allies were pushing back, forcing the enemy toward the Rhine. Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry, was ordered to capture a small Belgian village called Holtzheim. There was a problem. They didn't have enough men. The company executive officer had been killed. Casualties had piled up. Funk, now acting executive officer, looked at the roster and knew it wasn't enough for a frontal assault. So he walked into the headquarters tent. Inside were clerks, supply men, cooks, soldiers who normally never saw combat. "You're all infantry now," Funk said. They grabbed their weapons. The march to Holtzheim was 15 miles through waist-deep snow, under a driving blizzard, with German artillery harassing them the entire way. Funk led from the front. When they reached the village, Funk organized the assault. House by house. Room by room. 15 buildings cleared. 30 prisoners captured. Not one American casualty. Another unit took 50 more Germans on the far side of town. 80 prisoners total. They were herded into the yard of a farmhouse. Funk could spare only 4 guards. "Hold them here," he said. "We'll send help." Then he turned back toward the fighting. He had no idea what was happening behind him. While Leonard Funk was still fighting his way through the far side of Holtzheim, the situation behind him collapsed. A German patrol moved through the village, 10, maybe 20 men, wearing white camouflage capes that blended perfectly with the snow. In the confusion, in the smoke, in the fading light of a winter afternoon, they looked almost identical to American troops. The 4 guards at the farmhouse never saw it coming. By the time they realized the mistake, rifles were already pressed into their backs. They were disarmed, shoved to their knees, hands locked behind their heads. The prisoners were free. 80 German soldiers surged forward, grabbing weapons from the pile in the snow. Rifles. Machine pistols. Grenades. Within minutes, 90 armed Germans stood in the farmhouse yard. They didn't panic. They organized. They knew exactly what they were going to do. Company C was scattered across the village, clearing isolated resistance. If 90 Germans hit them from the rear, it wouldn't be a fight. It would be a slaughter. A German officer, likely a lieutenant or captain, took command. He gave rapid orders, pointing, positioning men, setting up machine guns. They were preparing an ambush. That's when Leonard Funk came back. He rounded the corner of the farmhouse expecting to check on prisoners. Instead, he walked straight into death. 90 Germans turned to face him. 4 American soldiers knelt in the snow. Weapons everywhere. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the German officer stepped forward. He shoved the muzzle of his MP-40 into Funk's stomach and screamed a command in German. Funk stared at him. Blank. He didn't understand a word. The officer screamed again, louder, angrier. Funk looked around. 90 Germans. 4 disarmed Americans. 1 other GI standing beside him. The math was simple. There was no escape. No backup. No miracle. The rational move, the sane move, was surrender. But Funk wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about Normandy. About 84 Americans gunned down in a field after surrendering. About men begging for mercy and being shot anyway. He had already made his decision weeks earlier. He would never surrender. So Leonard Funk did the last thing anyone expected. He laughed. It started as a short burst. Then it grew. Deep. Uncontrolled. Loud. He bent forward, hands on his knees, shoulders shaking. The German officer froze. Confusion flashed across his face, then fury. He screamed again, louder, spitting words Funk still didn't understand. Funk laughed harder. Some of the German soldiers glanced at each other. A few of them started laughing too. The tension shattered. This wasn't how prisoners behaved. Men with a gun in their stomach begged. Cried. Complied. They didn't stand there laughing like the situation was a joke. For a few critical seconds, the German officer didn't know what to do. And Leonard Funk used those seconds. Still laughing, still bent forward, he slowly reached up toward the Thompson submachine gun slung over his shoulder. The German officer watched. Good. The American was finally surrendering his weapon. Funk's hand closed around the grip. He began to unsling it, slow and deliberate. The officer relaxed, just a fraction. That was enough. In one violent motion, Funk snapped the Thompson down, brought the muzzle up, and squeezed the trigger. The M1A1 Thompson roared. .45 caliber rounds tore into the German officer's chest at point-blank range. 30 rounds in less than 3 seconds. The officer was dead before he hit the snow. Funk didn't stop. He pivoted, spraying the nearest cluster of Germans. Men fell screaming. Blood sprayed across the white ground. Brass casings flew, steaming in the cold air. The magazine ran dry. 30 rounds gone. This was the moment everything could end. 2 seconds to reload. 2 seconds is eternity. Funk ripped the empty magazine out, slammed a fresh one in, racked the bolt, and kept firing, all in one fluid motion. At the same time, he screamed. "Pick up their weapons! Pick up their weapons!" The 4 guards lunged for the rifles dropped by the dead Germans. Seconds ago, they were prisoners. Now they were fighting. Chaos erupted. The Germans fired back. Bullets snapped past Funk's head. One round dropped the American soldier standing beside him, dead instantly. Funk didn't slow down. He moved. Fired. Shifted positions. The Germans had lost their officer. Their plan. Their nerve. They hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't expected this. In less than 60 seconds, the fight was over. 21 Germans lay dead in the snow. 24 more were wounded. The rest, more than 40, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The prisoners were prisoners again. Leonard Funk stood in the middle of the carnage, Thompson smoking, snow-stained red. He looked at his men and said calmly, "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen." The fighting in Holtzheim ended almost as suddenly as it had exploded. Company C secured the village by nightfall. The remaining Germans were rounded up, searched, and marched to the rear, this time under heavy guard, no chances taken. The snow kept falling. Bodies were carried away. Weapons were collected. The battlefield erased itself, the way it always does. By morning, Holtzheim looked like just another ruined European village. Except for the men who had been there. Word spread fast. A first sergeant. Outnumbered 90-1. A machine gun in his stomach. Who laughed and then killed 21 enemy soldiers in under a minute. At first, some didn't believe it. Stories in war grow quickly. Exaggeration is a survival instinct. But this one had too many witnesses. Too many bodies. Too much physical proof. Funk wrote his report like any other. No drama. No flair. Just facts. When the recommendation for the Medal of Honor reached higher headquarters, no one argued. The citation spoke for itself. Although overwhelmingly outnumbered and facing almost certain death, First Sergeant Funk, pretending to comply with the enemy's order to surrender, began slowly to unsling his submachine gun from his shoulder. Then, with lightning speed, he brought the muzzle into line and riddled the German officer. He immediately turned his fire on the remaining enemy soldiers, shouting to his men to seize the enemy's weapons. There was no debate. What Leonard Funk did at Holtzheim wasn't just bravery. It was clarity. On September 5, 1945, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. Japan had surrendered. The world was still reeling from 6 years of destruction. That morning, Leonard Funk stood in the White House. He wore his dress uniform. His medals felt heavy on his chest. Not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. President Harry S. Truman stepped forward. He placed the Medal of Honor around Funk's neck. Then Truman looked him in the eye and said something that would follow Funk for the rest of his life. "I would rather have this medal than be President of the United States." Think about that. The most powerful man on Earth. The man who had just overseen the end of the deadliest war in human history. The man shaping the future of the entire world. And he was telling a 5'5" paratrooper from Pennsylvania that this moment, meant more. By the end of the war, Leonard Funk had earned the Medal of Honor. the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 3 Purple Hearts, France's Croix de Guerre, Belgium's Order of Leopold, the Netherlands' Military Order of William. He was the most decorated paratrooper of World War II. You would never know it by talking to him. When the war ended, Funk went home. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on tour. Didn't become a motivational speaker. Didn't turn his story into a career. He went back to Pennsylvania. Back to desk work. Leonard Funk took a job with the Veterans Administration. Day after day, year after year, he sat across from men who had been to war. Men missing limbs. Men missing sleep. Men missing parts of themselves they could never name. He helped them file paperwork. Disability claims. Medical benefits. Appeals. It wasn't glamorous. It was necessary. He did it for 27 years. He rose through the ranks quietly, eventually becoming division chief of the Pittsburgh Regional Office. He married his wife, Gertrude. They raised 2 daughters. They lived in McKeesport, a working-class town where no one cared about medals. The Medal of Honor sat in a display case somewhere in the house. He rarely spoke about it. When people asked about Holtzheim, about the laughter, about the 90 Germans, he shrugged. Did what I had to do. That was all. In November of 1992, Leonard Alfred Funk Jr. died of cancer. He was 76 years old. They buried him at Arlington National Cemetery. Section 35. Grave 23,734. Among the heroes of every American war. At the time of his death, he was the last living Medal of Honor recipient from the 82nd Airborne Division in World War II. His name lives on quietly. A fitness center at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, bears his name. A highway in Pennsylvania carries it. A post office in McKeesport was dedicated to him in 2023. And still, most people have never heard of Leonard Funk. Most wars are remembered through numbers. Battles won. Territory gained. Casualties counted. But wars are not decided by numbers. They are decided in moments. Moments where one person makes a choice that defies logic, statistics, and fear. Holtzheim was one of those moments. Leonard Funk stood there with a gun pressed into his stomach, 90 enemy soldiers around him, his men already captured. Every rule of survival said surrender. Every calculation said death was inevitable. But Funk wasn't calculating. He wasn't counting enemies or weighing odds. He was remembering. He was remembering Normandy, 84 Americans executed after surrendering. Remembering friends who never came home. Remembering the men kneeling in the snow behind him, whose lives would end the moment those Germans launched their ambush. That's what courage really is. Not fearlessness. Not rage. Not strength. Courage is clarity when everything else goes dark. And clarity doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes, it looks like laughter. When Funk laughed, he broke the script. War runs on expectation. Soldiers expect prisoners to obey. Officers expect fear. Commands are followed because everyone understands their role. Funk refused to play his part. That laugh wasn't loud because it was funny. It was loud because it was wrong. Wrong enough to make a German officer hesitate. Wrong enough to confuse 90 armed men. Wrong enough to steal a few seconds from death. And in war, seconds are everything. In those seconds, Funk turned the impossible into the inevitable. History remembers the loud heroes. Audie Murphy charging machine gun nests. Alvin York standing tall in the Argonne. They deserve every word written about them. But Leonard Funk's story reminds us of something deeper. That heroism doesn't require size. Or strength. Or charisma. It requires presence. Funk was 5'5". A former store clerk. A man who spent most of his life behind a desk helping other veterans fill out forms. Yet when the moment came, when 90 men wanted him dead, he didn't freeze. He thought. And then he acted. There's something else about Funk that matters. After the war, he didn't chase recognition. He didn't build a legend around himself. He went back to work. Back to normal life. That might be the most extraordinary part of all. Because it tells us the truth about people like Leonard Funk. They don't see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as responsible. Responsible for the men next to them. Responsible for doing the job. Responsible for acting when no one else can. That's why Funk never bragged. To him, Holtzheim wasn't a story. It was a duty fulfilled. President Truman understood that. When he said he'd rather have the Medal of Honor than be president, he wasn't talking about power. He was talking about choice. Because no one gives you courage. You can't order it. You can't train it into someone. You can't promote it. Courage only appears when it's needed, and only if you let it. Leonard Funk let it. Most of us will never face 90 armed men in the snow. But we all face moments where fear tells us to give in. Moments where silence is easier than action. Moments where doing nothing feels safer than doing what's right. Funk's story asks a simple question. What do you do when the gun is already pressed into your life? Do you surrender? Or do you laugh, just long enough, to find your opening? Somewhere in Arlington National Cemetery, a small headstone sits quietly among thousands of others. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself. It simply bears a name. Leonard Alfred Funk, Jr. A man who proved that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes. It laughs.